Welcome to the History Slam podcast from Activehistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, with an excellent show for you tonight as we record. I literally just watched an outstanding new documentary called Born in Evin, which is a story that follows the child of an Iranian immigrant to Germany who is trying to piece together the early days of her life as she was born in this prison, and she was trying to put the pieces together in a situation where it's very difficult to find answers. And I'm very excited to be speaking with Tara Sapari-Farr, who is a researcher with the Human Rights Watch working in the Middle East and North Africa division, who's joining me from D.C. to talk about the film. Tara, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thanks for joining me tonight. As I said, I just watched the film, so my mind's going in a million different directions, but I'm very excited to have your expertise here to help guide me through this because, you know, as anyone who's listened to the show before knows, I'm a Canadian cultural historian, so this is a little outside of my realm, and I love learning about these things that I'm not overly familiar with. So let's start with the basic here of the film, with the title being Born in Evin, which is a political prison. And again, you know, not my level of expertise. So this is a place that I, before the film, wasn't familiar with. Immediately Googled it up and learned some of what happened there. But could you just talk to us to start about this particular prison? Because it seems like for Iranians and people who research and understand Iran, that this is a pretty notorious place.
So Evin is actually one of the main detention centers / prisons in Tehran. It's located in north of the city, where actually it's a much wealthier neighborhood. And right now it's actually right by a major highway. So if you commute from west to east or up north, you almost always drive by it. And the reason you found those references when you Googled the name is because historically many of the political prisoners and other activists who've been arrested by Iranian authorities have been detained in different wards of Evin prison. So it's not exclusively for political prisoners. Other crimes and such as, for example, some financial crimes, and people convicted of those might also end up serving time in Evin. But the reputation is certainly because of the large number of political prisoners who have spent time there. There are actually jokes in Iranian culture about Evin. About it being a place that more educated segment of the society end up, because at times in special wards of prison where particularly intelligence authorities arrest people, you have at times dozens of journalists, lawyers, political activists there. And it's actually a very sad and bitter reality. But yeah, these days, I think if you ask people what they think of Evin, many will be reminded of the political repression in Iran.
Was it a prison, or is it a prison that is associated with the post-revolutionary period? So that 1979, Khomeini comes to power, and the film at least seems to situate it as this was when political prisoners started to get sent there. Is that an accurate reflection of the history of this particular prison?
So actually the prison was open before the revolution, and it actually housed political prisoners before the revolution as well.
Okay.
So that's kind of the irony, and releasing prisoners, political prisoners from prison, very close to the days of Iran's 79 revolution was a very iconic moment that basically reunited people who were political prisoners with the revolutionary crowd. And ironically, the prison ended up being a place that, again, political prisoners were detained. There are actually people, political activists in Iran, who have served time both before and after the revolution in that prison. But the period, the crackdown against political activists, mainly leftist activists and members of the Mujahideen Khalq group, that took place in the first decade after the Iranian Revolution, also added to the negative reputation of this prison.
And I'm really confused. What I was really confused about early in the film, certainly, is this breakdown between pre-79 and post-79. Because as you just said, there were people who served in this prison both pre and post, and the film situates Miriam's parents, and we'll talk about Miriam and her story in a minute, but they situate her parents and her generation as people who were fighting for freedom and a more just society. And then you see the images of it, but then Khomeini comes in and takes power. So, just for people who don't know, what happens in 79 that this idealism that seems to emerge as part of the revolution is replaced by this repressive regime that gets put into place or assumes power, at least?
So in the years prior to 79, you have different political factions active against the ruling government, the monarchy government in power. Many of them actually belong to leftist ideologies. Some belong to more nationalistic ideologies and are closer to the ideology of the Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was ousted by what many historians call it a coup in 1953. And then you have many of the religious forces, more moderate or more hardline religious forces, kind of united in this fight against the government. And in the last few years, you have Ayatollah Khomeini emerging as the de facto leader for the revolution. Very quickly, you have him becoming the icon, arriving in Iran 10 days before the revolution finally succeeds, and then him assuming power, or the position of supreme leader or the leader of the revolution, as the transitional government is figuring out the new system. Referendum is being proposed. Different constitutional issues are being discussed. So at first, what you have is him occupying obviously this iconic and important position, but you have different political factions around him, and people who, for example, served in the interim government. Many of them ended up facing persecution afterwards. So what emerges out of the revolution at first is a government that has Islamic tendencies, but hasn't consolidated power fully, and there's an understanding that different political parties will be allowed to operate. What actually united all these different groups in their political fight was articulated by many of them as the fight against imperialism and what they saw as for example, United States role in decision making in the government. So there's a lot of that tendencies, but then very quickly you have the students taking over the U.S. embassy. in less than a year from revolution, and the interim government resigning in protests because Ayatollah Khomeini endorses that move, the interim government doesn't. So you have basically a group of people exiting the political structure, and then soon after you have things are volatile, and then you have Iran-Iraq war, you have some groups that take up arms against the government, and the idea of armed resistance against the government is revived. You have one of the main Marxist Islamist group, Mujahideen Khalq, relocating in Iraq and deciding to fight the government against that. So in this very volatile situation, and at the time that Iran-Iraq war is taking place, there's also a mass arrest of political opposition, many of them for accusations that are, or even charges that are very petty. There were people who were arrested for selling newspapers or for merely being members of political parties. And then the turns of events goes in a direction that the political establishment decides to make this very horrific decision that I'm sure we'll discuss more, to execute hundreds, if not more, members of the opposition parties who were detained in prisons across the country, and were actually, most of them were serving their time. So those are very quick turns of event but nothing can justify the crimes that have been committed.
And that's one of the things that's really interesting in watching the film, is that it does feel really fast, that this turnaround, as you mentioned, that it goes from revolution, Khomeini, and then executions, as you said. So, what is happening on the sort of day-to-day level for Iranians, people in Tehran, while this is going on? Like, if you're not someone who's identified at least as a strong political opponent, you're not maybe politically active at all, you're going about living your life and trying to avoid maybe this. Like, what is the day-to-day for people through this period? Is it a case where, like, I would almost get the sense that everyone is kind of really looking over their shoulder and making sure they're not saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, and it almost becomes like a police state of sort.
I mean, it's a very quick turn of events. So imagine revolution is a major turnover of power in Iran. It affects everyone's life. You have the referendum, you have the new constitution, you have very quickly enforcement of compulsory hijab. A lot of things are changing in the society, and there is this revolutionary fever. And there were, for example, arms that were distributed in the streets. So the government is trying to take back these arms, and they're setting up different systems, different neighborhood policing system to take these arms back, but also reinforcing whatever this new revolutionary rule is going to look like. And then a major turn of events is taking over the U.S. embassy, something that to this day has left a very huge mark on Iran's relationship with the rest of the world, particularly the Western world and the United States. And then you have the invasion that happens by Saddam Hussein. So regardless of where you stand politically, your life is in turmoil, and your life is going through big changes. It's a combination of maybe hope, maybe disappointment, maybe fear, uncertainty, and then it's a time that political activism is actually very popular among different families. If you read the stories of different families during that time of revolution, you have families with children who are members of different political parties. but maybe parents are not particularly educated or interested in politics, but then you have 4 children and 2 of them are members of one party, 2 of them are members of the other party. And then all of a sudden you have this, you also have this increased crackdown. And then you also have families that some members are pro crackdown, while some members of or some other family members are basically the affected community. But I think obviously there was no social media or mass media at the time, so the scale of this of what happened in the 80s was not known to the broader public for years. Basically, at the time that these executions were happening, you were only aware of it if you had a family member, and family members weren't necessarily openly talking about it as well. So you knew of a cousin or a relative who was in prison and didn't come back. So there was definitely this sense of fear and the silence, but I wouldn't say that it was broadly known by public. Actually, I think we'll talk about it. Something that happened in the past few years made it a much more widely known chapter of Iran's history than what it used to be in the early 80s.
Right, and in terms of the people not knowing, unless you had a family member, that's part of what I was going to ask is there's so much else going on, as you mentioned, the relationship with the United States, the Iran-Iraq war. How much does the new regime that comes to power after the revolution, how much are they using the external and the things that are happening internationally with Iran from we would say today, like a public relations point, to try to unite people behind those things while also keeping the news about the executions and that kind of stuff that quiet, right? Was that something that was used to great effect in trying to quell any sort of political opposition?
Definitely. So the war is the major event. The major news of the day is the war, and it's impacting people's life, and it's basically I think has been used to consolidate the more hardline factions of power in Iran, eliminating all the other people who were not behind us, the martial war and the need to defend. But that doesn't mean all the people who participated in the war or joined the military necessarily believed in the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Many people were merely defending what they believed was defending their homeland from an aggression. And it's, I think, important to also note that the executions happened very quietly and without any transparency, even within the within the semi-functional checks and balances that existed at the time. So there are all these different narratives how authorities weren't properly informed, or there was an attempt to keep the order to a very close circle of Ayatollah Khomeini and those revolutionary prosecutors who were leading the executions. So it wasn't a broad deliberation even among the people in power. It was a decision that was made ultimately, I think, by the highest people in the power, and was executed quickly in a very secretive manner. And then, as probably comes up in the film, there's also a lot of efforts to ensure that the families don't necessarily get a public ceremony or burial or memorial. There are a lot of repression that comes afterwards as well. So even to this day, there's no proper place of burial for these people, and there have been efforts to even destroy evidence and signs of some of these cemeteries across the country.
Yeah, so you mentioned the film, and it does follow the story of Maryam Zuri, who is a Iranian-born German actress, and it follows her efforts to understand the circumstances of her birth and subsequent move to Germany. And she's trying to get answers, and both of her parents were in the prison. She was, as a baby, let out, and then her mother and her go to Germany, and her father is left behind, and sort of follows the story of her trying to get answers. And she comes up with to a lot of roadblocks, not the least of which early in the film is her mother, who doesn't want to talk about this. So in addition to destroying evidence, as you mentioned, how common is this experience for, Miriam and I are the same age, so people in their mid 30s who are children of Iranian people who were in prison here, like how common is this experience in your work at the Human Rights Watch, that you have this generation of Iranians who don't know a lot about their early childhoods?
I mean, this is a very particular group of people. There are not few of them, but they haven't been united and they haven't talked to each other necessarily. Mariam's mom is basically a refugee who fled horrific persecution in Iran and had to raise her child in a society that was foreign to her and her pain. If you talk even to most first generation immigrants, they experience a lot of issues trying to integrate in the society and trying to succeed. So imagine Mariam's mom was not only had to deal with that, but was also carrying this huge burden, this huge trauma with her. And I think that's the powerful part of the movie, that shows how she pushed through all of these things to establish her life in Germany, but also chose to not open this wound that was probably very painful to think about. And many of the people who experienced persecution in that period were not very forthcoming with their experiences, and I think it's also important to understand that there's a gender element here as well. The political parties at the time, even the ones that were necessarily Islamic, they were kind of patriarchal in so many ways. So the experience of women in prison is less documented than men, even to the extent that it's been documented. So there are many layers of trauma, and there are many reasons why it's difficult for Mariam to find out the truth about her childhood. But I think part of it is this the silence that exists for many people, because that was the only way available to them to deal with their trauma.
And certainly this is something that has been studied, this way in which people deal with trauma, and then the trauma on the subsequent generation. And I don't know if it's ironic or not, but you see in the film her stepfather, who is a researcher of trauma and works with survivors of the Holocaust and children of survivors of the Holocaust, and is studying this transmission of trauma between generations. And then you see Miriam's relationship with her mother and sort of going on the same way. And I'll just say too that the story of Miriam's mother, just post Iran, is incredible. Sort of her story, right? She gets a doctorate, runs for mayor. Like she has this incredible story herself. Not only what happens to her in Iran, but her post-Iran story is amazing as well, and is captivating in the film. But it does lead to this question of when we're talking about trauma, and maybe this is something that you would come up against a lot in your research and your work on what's going on and what has happened in Iran. I can understand people not wanting to talk about what happened to them and not being able to, or not wanting to address that trauma in an upfront way. But just from a research perspective for you, and you mentioned that the gendered element, that the women's stories weren't really documented as well. How do you go about trying to determine what happened, figure it out, and come to some sort of conclusion that we can use to better understand this era of Iranian history?
I mean, what you mentioned is really interesting. I think Mariam's mom, consciously or unconsciously, is trying to prove that she's more than just a victim. She's proving her agency by accomplishing amazing thing in her life, and proving that she has the agency to become who she is. So getting through this difficult processing this trauma in a way that you're comfortable talking about it, comfortable documenting it, and assuring people that it is not just, it's not playing the role of victimhood, but participating in a process of documentation is very important. In part of the film, you see the symbolic trial, the people's trial, for the atrocities committed during that period. And I think that very much shows how many of these families are participating, are coming forward, are sharing their stories, and because they're convinced that by doing this, it will lead to a result. I think part of the problem, it's not unique to that period, but what we face in documenting human rights is explaining to people why documentation is important, because it's not easy for people to remember their most painful memories. Several people, starting with survivors of the persecution in that period, have worked on documenting what happened in prisons in Iran during the 80s mass execution, and have built evidence and lobbied different international entities and governments to work on this issue. But obviously there's a lot more that needs to be done. A few years ago, an audio tape was widely published in Iran that I think had a very important impact on carrying the message of these families to the broader Iranian public. The audio tape is from a meeting that took place at the height of these executions between basically the second person in command, the deputy of Ayatollah Khomeini, and 3 members of the panel that were deciding about the fate of these prisoners. It's probably the most important piece of evidence, an audio form of evidence that shows the thinking behind these crimes. In which the audio tape is a conversation. The deputy Ayatollah Montazeri was always known as a more liberal figure. He opposed executions at the time. He was put under. He was ousted from his position. He was put at different periods under house arrest. He always leaned towards supporting the activists and the broader social and political freedom. So in this audio, he's very critical of the approach, and he's very upset about this. He's found out about these executions taking place, and he thinks this is the most horrific crime that the Islamic Republic of Iran will be remembered. But this will be a stain that we can't wash off. And so his name was very prominent in the Iranian politics. Many people knew his name. He played a role during Iran's Green Movement in the aftermath of Iran's 2009 election. So that audio tape, when it was published and it was broadcasted through social media, different Persian TV stations outside the country, all of a sudden, I think, put something in front of the broader Iranian population that couldn't easily be denied. So I think it's a combination of working on documentation, but also finding ways to speak about it inside the country. I'm as much as the events outside the country and efforts for justice are important, but also finding ways to have this conversation with different parties, with the neighbor who wasn't aware of what happened to their own neighbor at the time, to people who thought the government was defending national security, to show them the way this was done was an absolute injustice. I think it's very important, and many people are doing this work, but there are many challenges.
Well, yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about, because certainly from a Western perspective, and I guess that part of it too depends on the type of media you consume, but I think there's a certain perception of Iran as a somewhat closed society, in that not a lot of international media gets in, that we have this view of there's not a lot of dissension that is allowed or tolerated. But then you had the situation with the where the Ukrainian aircraft was shot down, and then we saw images of people protesting in the streets. So that certainly counters the idea that there's no criticism allowed of the government. So for people who don't know, and I would include myself in this, what is the level of political discourse within Iran that would have these sorts of discussions that you're talking about what happened in the 1980s, about these executions? What is the permissibility of those, and how free are people to engage in these type of discussions?
So, I mean, I often struggle explaining Iran to people who have not experienced living there, because, as you said, it's a very repressive society, but it's also not a monotone society in a way that people behave in a certain way. You can have a very lively political debate in a shared cab, in streets of Tehran. You'll find your cab driver openly criticizing the government, and you will find people openly debating some of these issues. They don't make it to the state narrative. They're not broadcasted on state TV. Newspapers are not allowed to publish many of that, but this debate is happening, and now with social media, the boundaries are actually a lot harder to distinguish. And then we can explain. You have elected parts of the government, you have non-elected bodies, you have power struggle between these two over time. The non-elected bodies have gotten a lot more power, repressing even the limited space for elected bodies to operate. I don't think I would be able to explain Iran in this short amount of time. But just to give you a sense of how these issues make it to the political debate, I'm going to use an example. So in the last presidential election in 2017, the person who ran against the current president, Hassan Rouhani, who is now actually the head of Iran's judiciary, Ayatollah Raisi, Ebrahim Raisi at the time, he was actually one of the people who served on the panel that decided about the execution of prisoners. And this happened after that audio tape I mentioned was already published. So his past indirectly was very much topic of the conversation. And he was being portrayed as this very hardline figure with a very dark past, to the point that I remember I pay attention about Iranian elections. I remember I woke up one day and read one of Rouhani's election campaign speeches, and I was shocked, and I was like, I've woken up in a different planet, because he had referred to his own path different from the past record of repression and executions. And I'm like, well, are you indirectly referring to 80s? And this is not necessarily to say if his mention is a genuine commitment to reform or not. I think what we have seen indicates that it wasn't by any means. But it's just to show that this can go to this level, and the issues can be debated. Of course, there's a group of people who are defending the executions and saying it was the right thing, it was the necessary thing. All these people were terrorists. All of them were convicted of using arms against the government, and they deserve it. But then there's the pushback that also comes inside the country. It might happen through social media because people can post from anywhere they are, and it can be read. Twitter is still blocked in Iran, but almost all government officials have an account and actively participate. So the debate is happening. So it's very difficult to distinguish, but I wouldn't assume that this information doesn't get translated in the domestic political discourse because of the official red lines and censorship. And it's very difficult to explain how and why, but almost all these issues get debated. And occasionally, even official political figures make a comment about them.
And how much, too, does the mobility of people into and out of Iran influence these discussions as well? I mean, one of the things, of course, about the plane being shot down earlier this month was that so many, I can't remember the exact number, but a lot of the people on that plane were Canadian citizens, and the majority of the people on the plane were coming to Canada, a lot as students and faculty members here who were back in Iran, with the holiday break, visiting family and friends, those sorts of things. So you have this mobility into and out of, to a certain degree, even though it can be difficult. There's not direct flights from North America. How much does that mobility of people, going to different countries, studying, researching, and then bringing that background into Iran, how much does that influence these discussions? And, as we see around the world in other places, through both social media, the borders are starting to be broken down a little bit as people and ideas move around. How much does this seemingly internationalization of the Iranian population, has that started to influence these political discussions?
I would say the physical internationalization, the one you just described, the population migration, is an important factor, because in the early decades after the revolution, a lot of people with engineering and medical degrees went to the West to study. But more recently, particularly before the most recent administration to the U.S. came to power, and a lot of other issues came with it, including broad sanctions that are impacting the Iranian population in so many different ways. There were actually people in fields of humanities, art, social sciences also coming to study and widening the debate on some of these issues. So that element is important, but also I would not understate the importance of the quote unquote digital space. It started with satellites in Iran. Some of the satellite channels were based in, for example, Los Angeles. A group of diaspora people didn't have the same quality, but now you have actually channels that are quite popular in Iran. They're combination of entertainment and news. So you have the BBC Persian TV channel. That could be the main source of news for many people, and BBC has also competitors. There are different news channels, and then you also have the social media that people are using. Instagram is very popular, Twitter is very popular, Telegram is very popular. So the border that you just described, either physically or digitally, is less meaningful, because people who might be sitting in a village in Iran can have access to information. In 2014, I think, Iranian government allowed internet 3G and 4G internet on on cell phones that exponentially increased access to information. And that's why we have massive internet shutdown when we have popular dissent, because it's recognized that actually social media played a role in different elections in the country. Candidates used it as their main tool to disseminate their messaging. So it's both physical but also digital. And also bear in mind, like in, let's say, 80s and 90s, if you had a family member living in Canada, Europe, US, the best you could do, if you could afford it, was a phone call once a month. Now with cell phone applications, I talk to my parents a couple of times a day if I have to. I constantly know where they are, what they do. It's the same for the rest of Iranians' families. So there's a constant communication and exchange of information. If I want to react to something that's unfolding in Iran or here, where I'm sitting in the United States, all I need is to text someone on my WhatsApp or other messaging app, and it doesn't matter where they're located. So this exchange of information is not only happening physically but also through digital space.
What do you think people will get out of this film? You know, it's showing in Toronto on Sunday. You're going to be there to lead a discussion afterwards. You know, for this won a bunch of awards in Germany at the Berlin Film Festival, which I'll mention in a minute. But for someone who is a researcher in what happens in Iran, obviously you mentioned your personal connection to the country. For people who are coming to this film and seeing it, what do you expect the reaction to be, or what have you seen the reaction to be from people who have seen it?
What captured me about this movie, and the reason I was very excited about showing it at the festival, is what I said in the beginning. It's a personal story, but it allows you to get very close to seeing one of the darkest chapters of Iran's recent history through the eyes of a person who actually grew up in the West but is searching for truth about her own childhood. I found it very easy to connect to this story. And what I hope people get out of it is the same thing, being able to follow this story, because it's a very difficult part of the history. It's a very painful part. It's a very dark part. But I think the film does a very good job of telling it in a personalized narrative that makes it easy for the audience to relate, even though they might not have the necessary political or historical understanding of the context.
Yeah, I agree. I grew up outside of Toronto. My name is Sean Graham, right? You sort of get a sense of what my family history is based on that name, and so very different background, but the humanity of this film just makes it very easy to attach yourself to it, and it really is quite captivating. So I completely agree with everything you said. And as I mentioned, go on Sunday, February the 2nd, 1 p.m. at I say that wrong all the time whenever I say it. Sunday, February 2nd, 1 p.m. at Hot Docs Ted Rogers Cinema. This is part of the 17th Annual Human Rights Watch Film Festival that's going on in Toronto. The film, born in Evin, it won a ton of awards. It's an official selection from the Berlin Film Festival, winner of the best film, the Perspektive Deutsch Kino program in 2019. Just a wonderful film, so definitely go check it out. And Tara Sapari Far will be there on Sunday leading a discussion. So for people coming to that, the discussion side of it, are you planning a Q&A type thing, or do you have a presentation lined up? Like how does that discussion going to go?
We're hoping for a Q&A with me and another very interesting person, a sociologist who will be on the panel.
Okay, so definitely go. Should be a wonderful day. Even if you're, a big Super Bowl person, you can go to the film, you can participate in the discussion, and you'll be home easily in time to watch the Super Bowl. But, after
Can I
seeing
make a correction?
Please do, yeah.
Because I know I will be held accountable.
Yeah.
So our other panelist is a sociocultural anthropologist, and I know there's a big difference, so I don't want to.
Yeah, we don't want the sociologists getting after us.
Yeah,
exactly. they're a vicious bunch. Yeah. So definitely check it out. And Tara, thank you so much for joining me this evening, and safe travels up to Toronto this weekend.
Thank you. I'm very much hoping for not super cold weather.
Yeah, hopefully not. I think it's been okay recently. As long as you don't get any snow, no delays, we should be fine.
That's what I'm hoping for.
If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can find us at historyslam@gmail.com. I am at Dr. Shawnee Fever on Twitter. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show on Google Play, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your show. Give us the likes, ratings, all that fun stuff to keep the show going. And we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.